Beth Short and the Carnivals of the Damned by Monique Bos. Inspired by Vumskut's Angel. Elizabeth Short was a ghost even before she died. The people who knew her said no one really knew her. She'd leave them mysteriously and hint at destinations she was too coy to reveal. Perhaps she, ephemeral as a butterfly, didn't know herself when she left one spot where she would next alight. Her pale eyes seemed always to be fixed somewhere else, on a dream, another horizon, some other life. She embodied longings waiting to be fulfilled. She was deliriously and desperately eager for love, inventing for herself dramatic roles, fiancée of a fighter pilot, bereaved war widow. She craved a husband, a baby, a house, yearned with desire so deep it sabotaged its own possibilities. She entranced and frightened men. She teased them and obsessed them, and became obsessed in turn. Death opened her up and laid her out, naked and raw. Death granted her immortality and notoriety, sealed her secrets forever between the two halves of her body, abandoned on a vacant lot in L.A. In death, she found her new identity, cribbed together from the color of her clothing, and the flower she usually wore tucked behind an ear. The Black Dahlia. The drab man named Oliver had come to Savannah for two reasons: the St. Patrick's Day celebration on River Street, and the girls carried on its tide of cavorting and camaraderie, was the first. Bonaventure Cemetery was the second, the sprawling, picturesque graveyard on the edge of the marsh, with its mildew-streaked marble tombs and lavish memorials, its Spanish moss and azaleas, made famous by midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Oliver had not read the book or seen the movie. He did not care who was buried among the camellias and meandering pathways. He simply liked graveyards. He had rented a canoe, and he approached Bonaventure from the marsh under a florid moon. He would have liked to use the main driveway, flanked by statues of mourning female angels. Oliver found the sorrow of women compelling. But the gates were locked at 5 p.m., and he did not want to draw attention by parking near the entrance after hours. He came instead by water, gliding like an alligator beneath low-hanging branches, slipping onto the muddy bank as fiddler crabs scurried to their holes. The girl was conscious when he lifted her out of the canoe. Her eyes were darker than Elizabeth Short's appeared in the black and white photo seat scene, and huge, the pupils so dilated that the iris ringing them was a thread-like sliver of blue. She shook her head at him and tried so hard to scream that she gagged against the duct tape over her mouth. "It's okay," he told her as gently as he could. "I'll try not to let it hurt." He carried her uphill into the graveyard, past myriad angels, small gnome-like cupids peeping around the edges of dogwood bushes, dignified guardians with bowed heads, massive seraphim with wings spread in benediction, as if to comfort the lost and redeem the damned. Not that the damned wanted redemption, Oliver thought wryly, settling the girl on a flat marble tomb he had chosen the previous day. Even now, the merry and careless hordes would be ending their debauches and drifting into uneasy sleep. River Street would be littered with broken plastic cups, strings of beads with four-leaf clover pendants, feathers fallen off boas, sticky puddles of beer. Well-off visitors, guests, the image-conscious Savannians called them, would tangle amid strangers' bodies in air-conditioned hotel rooms with views of the river or the spires of downtown or the bridge. The Savannah River would flow by, murky and sluggish, too polluted to reflect pure green. No Sybarite himself, Oliver had spent several miserable hours on River Street before he'd found her. He sported a tacky and colorful Hawaiian shirt, the design splashed liberally with green to ward off unwelcome pinches from strangers. He had fought elbows and arms, feet that stomped on his and beery faces that leered too close. He had endured spilled liquor on his clothes, saliva in his feather boa. So careless, these anonymous souls, with their DNA. So regrettable for them that they sloshed their green drinks from the corners of their mouths onto his leprechaun hat, or spat onto his beads with their whiskey-slowed tongues. He came away bruised, oddly exhilarated. "I have walked among the damned," he thought, paddling his lonely canoe beneath moss-weighted oak branches and crepe myrtles. Drab Oliver, scrawny-necked, scraggly-haired, saggy-gutted, reflected, "I have felt their breath on my skin, and still I am pure." On River Street, he had silently seethed. He hated the revelers, with their merry and carefree hedonism, their festive brilliance that so easily degenerated into grotesquerie. "Look at yourselves," he wanted to say, to exhort. He wanted to stand on the ancient stone steps, his feet higher than the head of the tallest man in the crowd, and cry out, "Look at how you degrade yourselves, your beauty, your youth. Tomorrow you'll awaken late and do it all again, and even after you've recovered from this weekend, you'll go on. There will be other weekends like it, other carnivals of the damned, other places where you and your fellow lost souls frolic, until someday you're dead and your bones disconnect, drift apart in the grave. And then, will you matter? Will anyone even remember how you drank and danced, laughed and debauched? No, because a new generation will have passed, and another after that, and numberless pairs of feet will have waltzed on these cobblestones. Myriad stomachs emptied themselves of a night's excess in these alleys. Infinite anonymous couples mated in the darkness. You don't matter, any of you. You're not making an imprint on this space through which you pass. Except those, he added in his mind, whom he saved, whom he singled out from the mad masses, whom he etched into time and cast in immortality with his love. So no one on the crowded street paid attention to the man who negotiated the spaces between drunken knots of celebrants with careful control. Nothing about him drew notice. He seemed, if anyone had noticed, to watch for someone, to scan faces with a sober alertness, an edge of expectation resisting disappointment. Other eyes skipped over him. Girls looking for a good time barely registered him. He had 15 years on most of them, his hairline pulling back from a forehead that wore its age in lines and wrinkles. People poured in and out of the open-fronted bars facing the river. Bedraggled travelers with bandana-clad dogs begged for change or played hacky-sack in the open spaces between the street and the water. Bright white steamships with green bunting rested against docks. Even in darkness, the river beyond wore a sickly shade, the grease-slicked brown of mud and pollution and corruption. Oliver had debuted his signature style in Los Angeles, as was fitting on a New Year's Eve. No one drew connections to the Black Dahlia murder more than a half-century earlier. He left her in a vacant lot, yes, but placed far from the sidewalk and arranged with care. He tucked a brilliant crimson dahlia behind her ear and sprinkled confetti over her white breasts and belly and thighs. He draped a pink feather boa around her neck and coyly arranged it over her nipples and crotch, concealing her most private parts. He had placed a party hat on her head and a noisemaker in one hand, an empty plastic champagne flute in the other. She was not exposed, like Beth Short had been, not defiled. She had not been tortured or taken, and the coroner determined that she died quickly. That hadn't been his inaugural killing, but he considered it his first mature piece, the debut of an artist operating at the full extent of his powers. He followed it with Mardi Gras in New Orleans, St. Patrick's Day in Boston, the 4th of July in Philadelphia, Halloween in Salem. After that first scene, he began leaving them in graveyards, nude except for the feather boas preserving their modesty, holiday kitsch in their hands. They shared some of the Black Dahlia's mutilations, but always post-mortem. This killer, admitted the stymied forensic psychologists, didn't seem to enjoy his victims' suffering. Their perfect, beautiful deaths were a gift, his gift to them and to his muse. Oliver saw Beth Short, dead for 6 decades, denied love and robbed of grace, looking out with the countenance of every silent stone angel who watched, stern and benevolent, over the bodies of the girls he sacrificed to her. "Hush," said Oliver to the girl. She lay on her back, stretched full length on a concrete slab beneath a cross carved with roses. Her hands, bound together, were tied above her head. Her back arched, and her nipples, erect with the chill in the air and her own fright, showed through her bra and thin shirt. He barely glanced at them. A pungent odor drew his attention to the puddle growing beneath her. "Sweetheart," he said, "you should have told me if you needed to go. You don't have to be afraid." They're always afraid, he thought. They always wet themselves. He wished he could reassure them, or perhaps render them unconscious so they wouldn't have enough awareness to register fear. But then he'd miss that final, exquisite, terrible knowledge in their eyes. He reached to the waistband of her jeans. When his fingers brushed the skin of her belly, she flinched away. Her navel ring caught moonlight. "You're so beautiful," he said. She fought. He unfastened the buttons and the zipper, slid her pants and thong down her slender legs and over her feet, bare because he already had taken off the pumps she wore. She whimpered, struggled. "I just want to get you out of these wet pants," he told her. "I'm not going to take you." Tears slickened her cheeks, slid toward her ears. He stroked her calf, smooth except for a small stubbly patch she must have missed when she was shaving. "He hurt you," he told her, and even in her panic, she blinked in confusion. "I'm not going to hurt you." Around them, stone angels watched with blind eyes or bowed their heads in sorrow. She started to fight again, kicked at his hands, thrashed, flailed. Urgent noises came from her throat. He stabbed her quickly in the chest and the stomach, drove the knife in hard so he wouldn't need to do it over and over again. He wanted her not to have to suffer. He sat and stroked her hair and murmured while she bled. "They're waiting for you, the angels," he said. They're holding their hands out to receive your soul, Beth. Don't you see? They'll explain, and then you'll understand, and you won't be upset anymore. You'll know what I saved you from." After she stopped breathing, he ripped the tape away from her hands and mouth. He cut off her shirt and bra with the knife. She was beautiful, like Snow White, pale, ethereal skin with tangled black hair and crimson blood from between her breasts. He put her things in a plastic garbage bag, along with the tape. He kissed the air just above her cooling lips. "I love you, Beth," he said. Then he took the knife to her again and replicated Elizabeth Short's gruesome smile, edge of the mouth to lobe of the ear. But hers had been made while she was still alive and had been one of the causes of her death, according to the autopsy. He didn't want her to experience any more pain in this new dying. He added his own touches at the end, a green feather boa arranged artfully around her body, covering her genitals and one nipple, an open fan covering the other breast, a plastic green derby hat on her head, strings of green beads spilling from her fingers. He stepped back and looked at her. His eyes blurred. She was exquisitely lovely, and she was his, in an intimacy no one else could possibly share. He touched his fingers to his lips, blew the kiss out into the swamp-tainted air of the graveyard. "I've saved you," he said. "This time I've saved you." And he backed away slowly. Growing up in Massachusetts, she was Betty, a girl next door with dark curls and bad teeth and fantasies. She babysat and worked at a cafe. Her daddy had left a decade earlier, departed on a train for the West Coast. Oliver had read all the books about her, the famous Black Dahlia. He grew dahlias, only the dark colors, deep red and purple and various hybrids he produced, trying to achieve black in his garden in homage to her. He photocopied and enlarged photographs from books about the murder, and her face, framed, immortalized, looked at him from every angle in his small bungalow in a Denver neighborhood as nondescript as its owner. She was his inspiration, his guardian angel, his fantasy, and the source of the only ecstasy he experienced. In her travels around Southern California, she searched endlessly for love, for identity. She was desperately seeking him, Oliver thought. It was just that she'd been born 50 years too soon. He reached back through time and tried to touch her. Someone burned her with cigarettes, slashed her, beat her head and face, forced her to eat shit. Someone sliced 3-inch gashes from the edges of her lips to her earlobes, leaving her rotten, decaying teeth that, in life, she tried to whiten with wax from candles, ghoulishly grinning. Someone sawed her in half and left her naked body sprawled. Warning, message, sacrifice, defiance, inches away from a sidewalk in a vacant lot. She was maddening, paradoxical, impossible, impenetrable. She deserved worship and reverence, not the ignominy of the way she was killed and her corpse flaunted, not the rumors that lingered decades after her death, that she was a prostitute, that she had infantile genitalia, that she was a consort of mobsters and a calculating would-be extortionist or an abusive babysitter. She should not have been known for reasons that would have shamed her. She deserved dignity, a quiet death, respect. She deserved angels and solemn ghosts. Oliver did his best to give them to her as often as he could. In Bonaventure Cemetery, he bowed his head over the girl he'd just killed. "Beth, my love," he whispered, "I've redeemed another one for you. Another damned girl destined to become a tabloid darling dancing through the cruel carnival. I've saved her for you." He closed his eyes briefly. Mosquitoes droned in his ears, settled on his neck and arms and face, pierced his skin. He reached a hand to hammer one, and then remembered blood. The accoutrement of his latest victim held a feast of DNA he'd absorbed from the rowdy crowd. It was essential not to contaminate the scene with his own. "How many?" he whispered. The exhilaration ebbed. "How many, Beth, until you forgive me on behalf of all men and come for me?" He began, at last, to trudge back toward the canoe. He walked with less purpose, but still with deliberation, scuffling the gravel to hide his footsteps. He did not see the stone angel unfold her wings and step down from the memorial into his path. He only knew that when he looked up from the ground where his steps landed, she stood in his path, Beth Short, robed, winged, glorified, beautiful, and terrible. He reached a hand toward her. Her pale eyes looked at him directly, and not at some hazy horizon or distant dream. Even in his exhaustion, he understood the significance. Her mouth, the size and contours a mouth should be, no longer a visceral gash dissecting her face, curved gently. "What?" he said. She gestured beyond him, back toward the rose-twined cross and the marble slab, where he'd left the girl from River Street. "She was for you," he said. "All of them, everything, all of it, for you." She shook her head, folded her arms over her breasts. "What more do you want? What else could I give?" She looked past him then. He turned to and saw, rising from the slab, the girl, her naked body pale as marble. As she stood, she unfurled magnificent pale wings behind her, and then she walked toward Beth, toward the outstretched hand, without acknowledging Oliver's presence. Elizabeth Short, whole, graceful, maternal, enfolded the girl in her arms. "No more," she said to Oliver. "I can't let you take any more. I can't." And he didn't see her stone fist rising above his head, didn't feel it displacing air as it rushed down toward him. He only knew a final anguish and ecstasy as he looked into the face of his love and saw that she did not understand his gifts, did not want them, did not cherish all that he had done for her, all that he'd lived to give her. She left him crumpled there on the gravel path in the moonlight, skull broken, brains slipping out, crushed dahlias around him where her feet had trod. Beth Short bowed her head in sorrow for a brief moment, and then she followed the girl out of the graveyard. They glided away into a dawn that broke vibrant and trembling over the marsh, silent as angels, merciful as the grave.